Rocking and rolling. Welcome to 5 virtual icebreakers for virtual learning. I take a wild guess that at one point this year you were in some type of virtual setting, and I say this has become real near and dear to my heart because me personally, I am now an instructional technology and innovation coach. My position kind of came as a result of virtual learning. I work in a small district on Maryland's Eastern Shore, and it's called Worcester County Public Schools. And we are a one-to-one iPad district. We were planning the iPad transition actually right before COVID happened and everything shut down. So surprise, we were actually a little bit ready, which was fantastic to know. But with that being said, it was a big learning curve. So I've been able to really work with teachers on how do you engage kids in that online setting. I think we can all agree that it is not easy all the time and there are a lot of challenges, but I'm really excited to kind of just share a couple icebreakers that we have done this past year that I think our teachers have done really awesome with, that we have pulled together for you. And just as you start thinking about like, what is an icebreaker? Really, it's meant to kind of loosen people up a little bit, let them go through. One of the things that we really look at in our district is we look at this idea of creation. We won't want our kids to be great test takers. We want them to be creators. We want them to kind of harness that power of technology to take ideas, to analyze, to create something new from it. So what we did was we took the Everyone Can Create curriculum that is designed by Apple and broken down by its basic native tools of drawing, music, and photography. And we're pulled those into icebreakers that we say to people that are very usable on the iPad. And I know people always jump with me, oh, Brian, I don't have an iPad and I don't have that ability. But I say this, there's a lot of really awesome things in the Everyone Can Create curriculum that can easily be adaptable if you're a Windows device. And we're going to kind of go through that. And actually, one of the activities we're going to do side by side so we can really see what that looks like. To give you a quick run through of our agenda today, it's real simple. We're going to explore examples of icebreaker activities using some digital tools that we have used in our classrooms. The other thing that we're going to look at doing is I want you to look at the possible tools and resources. We, for the most part, have probably utilized some form of PowerPoint at some point in our life. You may not have used Keynote or Draw, but I want you to explore and kind of think about what you can do with them. And as we also go through, we're going to look at some icebreaker artifacts that my kids have done in my school district. And when we're done, we're going to kind of share on a Padlet to see what everybody has done, whether it's good or bad. And I say this, even if you're like, oh my gosh, it's not the best, like realize that's what we do for kids. Like sometimes like some things look better than others. And we'll kind of go through that. What I've done real quickly in the chat, and I hope I've got it there for everybody. If you came in a moment or two late, you may not have seen. I'm going to kind of throw it in there again. It's just kind of a walkthrough of some of the activities that I'm going to do today. In case I reference a template and you want to actually do it with me, you're definitely going to have that ability to do. Today's tools, I'm going to be primarily working off of the iPad, but I'm also going to be jumping into a couple other things. And what you're going to see here is we're going to be focusing on the draw tool, which most people know what the draw tool looks like. And people are like, oh, that's an iPad thing. There's also a little bit of draw capability in PowerPoint, which is really cool. We're going to work with our camera app. If you're using an iPhone, it's just as easy, or if you have another phone that has that camera capability, it works just as well. We're going to jump in with Keynote, which might be foreign to you if you're not an Apple user, but I would hope that PowerPoint looks pretty familiar to us. And we're going to kind of rock and roll with these 3 and 4 tools back and forth and really see what we can do. So let's get rocking and rolling. I'm going to kind of give you the 4 basics, and there's a 5th one that we throw in. Picture your name is really a cool idea. I say this all the time, is we're going into distance learning. We don't have the traditional school setting where we have the teacher posters up on the wall. Like, who knows what we have around houses? And you're actually going to get to see my house a little bit, because we're going to go through and kind of look at different pictures or posters that you might have, and kind of focus on grabbing a letter so we can kind of make that collage for your name. Another one that we always do is personify something, which is one of my favorite ones. So people are like, oh, that's so like elementary and kiddish. It's an icebreaker. It's meant for kids to kind of feel how, show how you feel. And what I say with that is, what we always do is we kind of realize that social emotional learning was important, but we learned it was even more important when we went into our pandemic world. So what I always told kids was, when we went to our Personify, we actually told kids like, hey, we're going to take this object and personify it into a living object. And maybe you can have it look how you feel that day, which is definitely an opportunity. Okay. So another option is the say hello, which is a really simple one.
Hi, my name is Gavin, and here's some facts about me.
So as you go through, you can kind of look at Gavin and see some of the basics like, hey, what is that? That's Clips. That's another app. We may not get there, but it's an opportunity for a kid to introduce themselves. If you have recently moved into, I say this in my school district, we are getting ready to move into term 4 where we switch some classes. So like this is an opportunity for a kid who's virtual to kind of share a little bit about themselves. So kind of a neat little tool. And the last one we're going to jump into is my baseball card. And I love the baseball card atmosphere because this is done really by an elementary school kid. And people are like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that. Like, with the exception of class of 2034, like that, my son, who's 6 years old, was able to create this. So people are like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that. I'm like, yeah, little kids, if you model the way and work your way through, like you can absolutely do it. We did that activity with our kindergarten and first grades this year, and they looked like a kindergarten or first grader did. I mean, no surprise, but we also did them that were a little bit more advanced where we had our high school kids do them. And it was really cool to see what they were able to accomplish. So we're going to rock and roll with, I'm going to try to hit all 4 of those. And if we, hopefully we'll get to our 5th. What I always tell folks to do right now, I'm going to switch over into demo mode. When I say demo, like I'm actually going to get my iPad up and running so you can take a look at it. And I'm going to ask you, if you are on your own device right now, whether it be an iPad, an iPhone, you're on maybe your PC and you want to jump along, this would be a fantastic time for you to just take a moment and get that device, get that turned on and get ready to rock and roll. Because I would love, as we're going through, like one of the things I love about professional learning is having teachers have the opportunity to really kind of go through the steps with me, because I think that's super important for them to actually like experience what kids do. And I really want that from you guys today, to have that opportunity. So we're going to just pop my iPad on the screen here momentarily. I'm going to kind of maximize it so we can all see it. And from there, I'm also going to try to share screen just so we can check it all out today. Awesome. We got the iPad. Now we just got to share with you guys so you guys can take a look at it. So cool. Desktop. Awesome. So if somebody in the chat can just give me a yes, or preferably a yes, like, hey, I can see your iPad, that would be a huge help for me. Just let me know. You can see an iPad. It's got a black screen. It's got some stuff on the back. Cool. I see some people in the chat coming through. Yes. Angela, fantastic. There's somebody listening to me. So I'm going to start off with my name activity. So as you may or may not know, this here is your camera opportunity. So like, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get a little vulnerable here. I'm going to show you my like working office. I say to people all the time, like, please do not judge. Like, I'm like a lot of people, like I got some degrees on the wall. I got some stuff. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk over to one of my pictures. I'm a classic person who loves old newspapers. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here, like I'm going to look at that B, because B is the first letter in Brian. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to come up and snap a photo of it. It may not seem like, oh, like really, like what I would do is I would actually have students go around, and what I would ask them to do is real simple. I would ask them, hey guys, go around your house and spell out your name and take a photo of each little piece, like the B, the R, the I, the A, and then what we're going to do is we're going to mix that together. So, and I'm going to show you what that looks like. I'm going to show you 2 different ways. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to open my Keynote, and at the same time, I'm going to actually bring up my PowerPoint as well. So just so you guys know, I got Keynote on my left, I got PowerPoint on my right. And what I'm going to do is, like most programs, we kind of get these blank slides up there. I'm going to make sure that I take off like that blank component of it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with my Keynote first. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to go up to my add photo. And what I'm going to do here is I just took that B, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to just insert that photo. And what's going to happen is that's going to be like really, really big. And that's not going to work for me. I need to go through and I need to kind of annotate it. I'm not annotate, but crop it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to just go through. We'll take out all that other stuff. And now I'm just going to put the B there. Okay. And once I click done, I can kind of go through. I'm going to move it around. I might kind of make it bigger. Eventually, I might want to kind of change the style. And people are like, what do you mean by change the style? I might want to just kind of rotate it just a little bit. So I have a little bit of kind of a cool look to it. And what I'm going to do from there is I'm going to go through, and what I would tell my students to do is like, I want you to go through and do every single letter of your name. So to go like look back on the iPad, excuse me, on the I can't say it, the PowerPoint world, like, hey, how would I do this here? It's the same idea as Keynote. It just has a little bit different look. So what we're going to do is we're going to go up here to our insert. We're going to go to our photos. It's going to do the same idea. We're going to be able to tap that in there. Now, with that being said, there's a slight difference when we get in here for pictures. When you're working with PowerPoint, you have to actually go to a crop button. Apple doesn't necessarily make you do that with Keynote. So what we'll be able to go through there is kind of work my way through my letter. Same idea. And once I'm done with that cropping and just kind of tap off to the side, you can go through now, make it a little bit bigger, smaller. Same idea if you want to kind of rotate it, you have that same idea. So if you notice, like we've just done the first letter, it's a really simplistic. The cool thing about this is, like I say this about my house, we have like little signs in the bathroom. My daughter might have a poster on a wall. Like you have your kids having the ability to go actually like take pictures of letters around their house and actually practice and try this. So what I'm going to ask you to do now, I'm going to try to challenge you. I want you all the time to have that ability to get the same experience as your students. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of put a slide timer on here, and I'm going to give you 5 minutes. And people are like, well, what do you want us to do in that 5 minutes, Brian? I want you right now to stand up in your house, your school, your classroom, wherever you are, and start walking around where you're at. And what I want you to do is take a photo or a picture of all the letters of your name. And let's see if we can kind of put together our name. See if we can spell it out. I'm going to work on mine just as we're doing our 5 minute timer. So I'm going to tap on the timer. I'm going to pause. If you have any questions, like as we're doing this, absolutely, like, ask the question. I'll gladly answer. I'll make sure I'm checking the chat. So we have a 5 minute timer. Let's go make our name. Right. Fantastic. Awesome. So what we just did was we had this like awesome time just to go through and really see like how do you take simple objects around your house, whether it be pictures or posters, and really come back and recreate it. What I always tell kids to do, and this is where it can kind of get kind of unique, and because you might say like, hey, Brian, like I'm a Google Classroom or like we use Google Slides, like this works in Google Slides. The last step that I always tell folks that I think is really important is I want them to be able to share this, whether I was talking about my PowerPoint or if I was talking about my Keynote, either way. The easy thing that you can do with this, if you're in Keynote, just export it, and you can export it as an image. If you're in PowerPoint and you're only doing this, you can do the same idea, kind of share it, maybe share a copy, depending on how you send files back and forth with your students. And like I said, really awesome opportunity, because now we've been able to like take the basics of their home and kind of make that a part of their classroom, which I'm super excited about. And I'm going to ask you, if you're working on yours still, like I'm going to ask you just to pause for a few moments. We're going to have some time here at the end to kind of work through some different ideas, but like I want to try to hit as many of these ideas as we can while we're working together. But like I'm super excited. In the chat, can somebody tell me like how many people were like, hey, Brian, like I was able to get it. I got it done, right? Or at least I have an idea. I know sometimes when you're kind of from afar, it's kind of hard to see the chat. How you drop in. Oh, cool. Brian, when you crop in Keynote, if you just tap on the image and just kind of do a double tap, you're going to be able to see like right here. This is the zoom. If you want to zoom in and out. So if I want to like go in and out, but if you just want to crop, it's literally like you just drag right here and around. So like I said, and Katrina, another cool thing, and if you're like, hey, like Brian, I'm not a Keynote guy, like I'm more of a PowerPoint guy, or I'm a Google Slides, like you can totally do that. I always say like, don't jump on like, oh my gosh, it's an Apple tool. Like I say this all the time. Like to me, I mean, I say this, I did these type of activities way before we became an Apple district. Like the Apple thing's just kind of cool now. Like I like it. But I mean, I totally get like we were Chromebooks for a long, long time. We did everything in Office 365. Like that was our tool. So like I said, it's one of those things where we had to kind of work through it as best that we could. So we talked about the first activity, which is we've just accomplished, which I'm really excited about. We went through and we created our name now, okay? Whatever platform that you did. The other activity that we had, it was called Personify. And for some of those folks who are just jumping in here, I'll say it again. In the chat, I'm going to drop the link again that I threw out earlier, just because it's kind of helpful to walk through some of my examples since I don't have my original slide up. But I'm going to do another one. It's called Personify. Social emotional learning was always important. I always say this, people are, oh, it's so important. It was always important. Now it's even more important because we got kiddos who haven't been in the building for a year. I hope that you're back, but who knows? So what we're going to do is what I would always tell kids is, hey, we're going to personify something. Tell me how you're doing today. What's your feeling or emotion? And we kind of start with that. And what we do is we're going back into our camera app. And if you have an iPad or an iPhone, you can do this with that. I know on my Chromebooks where I was at, I could click add photo and it would use like the little camera on my Chromebook. Not my favorite way to take a photo, but it would work. And what I would do is I would go around my house. So like I say this all the time, like guys, I am in my office. This is nothing special. Hey, this became like the normal thing of school, but I don't want my problems with, actually I could probably do it with just this. Like this here is a normal fan. So like, hey, I can make this fan come to life, but being true fashion, I want a little bit more light on. Oh, never mind. Oh, there we go. So I'm gonna just take my photo of it. This one here, Personify, is a little bit more of an Apple type of tool. And I say that because we're going to use our markup component in there. And I'm going to show you the markup, but if you're like, hey, I'm not an Apple school, like that's not going to work for me. What I'm going to do afterwards is I'll show you how I would do it in PowerPoint. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to tell you to take this and make it come to life. So what I always tell kids to do, go up in here to your edit, and an iPad or even an iPhone, if you're going here, you can go to these three dots and give you your markup tool. You're like, oh my gosh, my markup tool, what's that mean? Your markup tool is this really awesome set of basic drawing tools. You're like, well, what do I do? Like, yeah, you can really do a little bit of everything with it. And what I always tell kids to do, like, hey, tell me how you feel. So like today, and over on my side, I tell folks I'm on the Eastern Shore, Maryland, East Coast time. Like it's super sunny outside. So like I'm kind of bright and sunny day. So like what I'm going to go through is like, I'm going to create here. And I would say, oh, that's a little bit, I need that a little bit thicker. So I'm going to change this up. Like these are going to be like my eyes. Okay, maybe I'll make those eyelashes. And what you're going to do is you're literally just going to draw on this, and we're going to kind of make it come to life. And I think that's such an exciting piece to do because it's really a simple activity, but more importantly, like we're making things fun for our kids. We're letting them tell us how they feel by being creators of content. So let's see if I can kind of get like a funky nose there. So since I have this little fan, I got like the most perfect teeth here I could use. Okay, whereas I have like teeth, maybe, and people are like, well, why would you share your teeth? I'm hungry. Okay, so maybe when I go through here, I might kind of create my eyes a little bit. Oop, switch my colors. Okay, and I say this like, hey, everybody's got to have an arm, like. And what I would tell my kids is like, hey, go through, be silly, be creative with it, have fun. Because I say this, school hasn't necessarily been that much fun for some of our kids, depending on their situation, where they've been. And, you know, it's just the reality of the world we're in right now. So we need to take every opportunity to like really make learning come to life. And this is one of those opportunities where kids can do that. So here's how I would go through, and I would kind of create my drawing. And people are like, oh my gosh, like I need more time. Like me, man, give kids 3-4 minutes. Most kids are really awesome with the camera. So like, man, I just personified, like I made myself come to life. And all I have to do is click done. It saves a copy. So if I'm in Google Classroom, I can do a submit. My district uses Schoology. We would absolutely do that. Now, here's the thing. Like I see somebody in the chat said like, hey, you know what? I don't like, what app are you using? What tool? And here's what I would say. I'm going to kind of go through and take this same photo again of my beautiful camera. Sorry, my beautiful fan. And here's what I would tell you. If you don't have, excuse me, if you don't have that opportunity, what I always tell people to do is go into PowerPoint or go into a Keynote and think about how we can utilize this. So if I would delete some of this work that I had earlier, all I'm going to do is go into my inserts. I'm going to bring that same photo in, except this time I'm going to bring in the blank photo. I don't need design ideas because I'm going to be the designer. Kind of make that a little bit bigger. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to go into my draw tool right here. So even though I don't have the Apple component, like I can still use the same concept. I will say this, a lot of people I know said, like I know when I had Chromebooks, I did not have an Apple Pencil or anything to draw with. So that wasn't a possibility. So I would use my finger for most of it. And people are like, oh, really? You would use your finger? I'm like, oh yeah, absolutely. Or if I had to use my mouse, I would use my mouse. And I would totally go through, and that's just what would have to do because that's what we have. So, and that's the unique thing about distance learning. If you're like me, I learned very quickly that everybody has a different device. So I had to be able to make the same activity last. And I'm sorry, it shouldn't last. It should be accessible to 3 or 4 different students in 3 or 4 different ways, depending on how and what that they had. So kind of a neat opportunity. Like I said, same concept, just different tools. Use what works for you. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause because I'm all about giving you guys time to try this out yourself. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and I'm going to put, let's do 4 minutes on the clock. And I want you to, I want you to go through and personify your image. So take your time. I think I've answered some questions in the chat. Some folks have helped out. Thank you to Amy to answering some of them where I couldn't get to. So let's take some time and let's practice. Ooh, I moved my clock. Here we go. So we're working on our project. Okay. Cool. Awesome. Fantastic, guys. We have just rock and rolled through our second activity. I say this, I hope 4 minutes is really a stretch sometime, but you might be like, man, Brian, I got this. Super quick, super simple. So my last example, I'm looking at time. It's I say 5:32 my time, but you know, a little bit different your time. But we got a few more moments. I think I'm going to go through one more activity. The last one that I'm going to be able to hit today, which personally for me is like super near and dear to my heart, is we're going to go through and we're going to look at a template for a baseball card. So growing up on like the East Coast, like, man, baseball is huge out this way. And it's always been like a passion of mine to have my own like baseball card growing up. And people are like, oh my gosh, that's so funny. But it's definitely one that like I've always felt like, man, I got my little like slugger pitch. And I say this, I was an awful baseball player, but I love the concept of it. So before you jump in too much farther, no, excuse me, what I did was in the, I believe I threw that file originally into the chat, the icebreaker file. If you go through there, you should be able to, where it says baseball card down there. If you go down a little ways, it's going to see Apple and Windows. I have left this template for you, whether you want it in Keynote or if you would like to have it in PowerPoint, you have that available to you. So just say that again. That form that I dropped, it kind of walks through some of these. I know I jumped ahead from the say hello one, but the baseball card example, I have actually put the template in there. So if you want to download a copy of that template, which is exactly what you're seeing on the screen, I'm just going to talk through it a little bit. This is my son. He's excuse me, he is a kindergarten student. He's only 6 years old. And like I say this, we have like big aspirations for him, like any parent does. And I'm going to jump to the second slide. Kind of start backwards. Like, hey, what do you want to do when you grow up? Like, what he wants is like, man, he's like, man, daddy, I want to be a zookeeper. We're like, cool, awesome. So like what I'm able to do in Keynote, I go to the plus sign, and in Keynote, we have a lot of really cool shapes. So I'm not one to like go through every single shape. So you can kind of just go through your search. So I can say like dog, but if you want to work in the zoo, maybe you want like a zebra. Oh yeah, there we go, zebra. So like we have some options of like different animals in here to kind of showcase him as a person. So what I've asked students to do before, what I've asked students to do, like, hey, I want you to find like objects or symbols. I always try to encourage them, don't do like copyrighted images. And I say that to older kids. Younger kids, you kind of get what you get. But I always say, like, what are some goals? What are your stats? So like for Hayden, we have a fantastic technical high school. So like, he's like, yeah, I'm going to go to the technical high school, dad. Like, and I say, he says that because like I work out of there a lot and do a lot of stuff. So like what I did for the kids was I essentially gave them a template here to put in their own photo. I get some basic like school career plans, things you want to do when you're in school. Like, and I would give them examples like SGA presidents, and really simple. And what I would do is like have them create that card. On the top slide, what we would normally walk through is we have 3 schools in our district. Well, 3 primary areas, I should say. We would go through and like kids could go through and put the name of their school. My son goes to Pocomoke Elementary. So what we did was we had kids take turns going through and taking photos of each other. Now, this is a demo, so this is like a family vacation photo for us. The other thing that we did was we went through and we airdropped every kid a copy of their class logo. So if they wanted to use their school logo, they had it. Here, we would just put, I think when we did the original template, we put like the principal's name, and really simple. One of the things that you have in Keynote, which is available in PowerPoint as well, I say this, it's really cool to me to have kids like use the drawing feature. And people are like, well, why? I mean, I say this really simple because you never really know what it's going to look like down the road, like their handwriting. So like I wrote class of 2032, but like if I had to put like, hey, Hayden, sign your name, it'd have been like HAY because of his age. And that's perfectly fine because that shows kids like actual work. And I say that's super, super important. So I just want to kind of show you guys this template. People always ask me like, hey, Brian, how long did it take you to do this in kindergarten? And I would tell you it took more than 5 minutes. Doing it virtually, it was a huge lift. And I say that like we had the classroom teacher, we had myself and another tech coach, and we had an aide. And we went out into breakout rooms and we kind of walked some kids through it. And we all know this, that in virtual learning, we were really teaching the kids, but we kind of taught parents a little bit too. So it was actually beneficial. But if I was in the classroom face-to-face, I definitely think this is in my world, however you get the file to them, which in my world is airdrop. And then it takes about 10 minutes to do it. The more detail that you want it, the more challenging what you're going to get back. And I totally see that. So what I'm going to ask you guys to do, I think I have till 5:50. Is that, Amy? I'm going to ask you, is that right? Till 50. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause for a second. I know that you guys have this template. And what I'm going to ask you to do is I'm going to give you 3 minutes and say, like, can you get the front slide, or I should say slide, the front of your baseball card done? Can you get your name on there, your school? And I always say, let's have fun with this. Let's not do like our school where we work. Like, try to go back in time a little bit. Like, let's go our alma mater, where we actually went. So let's take 3 minutes and let's work on it a little bit. That's sometimes that's the problem. You want to keep working because you're like, man, I'm almost done. I almost got it in there. And I say this like I'm pretty good and I do this a lot. So like 3 minutes was a little bit of a challenge for me. So what I would say is absolutely know your learners. So like I said, I kind of redid my Wheeling Park High School days. So look here, we're at 5:42 and I'm realistic. I would love to hit the next two, but I don't know if our time will to give us adequate time to kind of go through it. But just like before, like I said, if you want to go through, if you're a Windows person, just export this as an individual file, then upload it to your learning management system or whatever really works for your setting. And I think that's huge. I'm going to stop the share screen just for a moment and kind of go back into my, there we go. Cool. I'm going to go back into my original keynotes that I had in there. So let's just kind of switch gears for a second. Cool. Back in our play minute. So awesome. So what I'm going to ask you to do, if you could, one of the things I really love with phones per se, really, if you have a phone or an iPad, you actually have a QR reader. So you can literally hold up your, hold up your camera open, and that actually open up to the Padlet. And what I'm going to ask you to do in your Padlet right now is, this is just an empty Padlet. I want you, if you could, take the next 2 or 3 minutes, and we're just going to share something that we created today. And it can be like anything that you've done, whether it be the name, if you want to kind of share the personified photo. If you had enough time to create your baseball card, I would love to see what it looks like, because that's such a huge help for me to see what other people have done. So what I'm going to ask you to do is just take a moment right now. And we're going to take, let's take 2 minutes. I know I lost my timer when I switched from the iPad. That's okay. Let's take 2 minutes and let's go through and just share out what we've done. So I'm going to set a timer over here on my side. Cool. We have 2 minutes. Yeah, let's rock and roll. Let's share out what we've done and see who's brave today. Cool. You guys can't see my timer, but we got about a little under a minute. You haven't looked now. I love it. We got the pie face going on here. I have to switch our share screen. Cool. So we're right around that 2 minute time, but kind of cool. We can go through and see. Kat, love it. Love the PowerPoint. It's looking awesome. Loved how you're able to pull it together. Oh, we got our kitty cat. Oh, love it. Love the cat. Man, fantastic. We got pie face. Man, you got a pie right. You're not sharing it with us. Oh, my kind of demo one. Yeah. So man, oh, cool. This is like my favorite part. Like Amy, I love the look. Class of 98. Yeah. I remember those days. Cool. Love the look. Lance, really cool way to do it. Man, you know what I love about it? You put it in your Google Photos, which is even awesome. Just because that's the cool thing about some of these Apple activities. There's so much that we can do with it. And everybody's like, oh, I don't have an Apple device. And I'm like, hey, I didn't have one for a long time either. And that's totally fine. You don't need it per se. So cool, guys. Cool stuff. I love that you're able to share. Normally what I would ask kids to do once they shared, hey, you want to share something about it? So if you want to get a little bit more in depth with some of this stuff, the easiest way to do it is look at the 30 creative activities for kids. It is thrown in that link of folders of stuff that I've done. I use the everyone can create. I don't use the assignments entirely. I take bits and pieces. We've been able to run a lot of family camps in the evenings in our district where we have our kids taking our devices home now because a handful of them are still virtual. So we've been able to pull a lot of ideas, and we take turns presenting, whether it would be our teachers, sometimes it's instructional tech coaches. Our principals are really awesome at jumping in here because it's a community builder for their school. So definitely a cool thing. If you want to connect after all this is said and done, I'm a big Twitter person. I would love to reach out and connect a little bit, talk about ideas, or if you want to share things that you've done. If you want anything from today's session, any of the templates, the files that I've done, that is the link. If you have a phone or you just want to scan it, you can absolutely do that as well. And that should take you to a Google Drive folder where you can actually see some of the activities and some of the examples. I did not get to the say hello one, but if you want to take a look there, I actually have an example for one of our students did this year, as well as their 7th grade rubric. Just I always say, hey Brian, that's cool, but how do you pull it together? I mean, that's definitely something cool to do. So as we finish up, Amy made the greatest comment. If you could do me a favor, and in the chat there is a evaluation form. I say it all the time. If you loved what you heard or something that really stuck out, please share about it. If something that you didn't like, this would make it better. That feedback is so important to me as well as other folks. So really appreciate it. So I think sharing is paused. I don't know if I did that. Cool, but yeah, definitely want to do that. Definitely a fun thing to do. I started to do it. I think it pulled up on my screen when I clicked. Amy's giving me that like heads up. Yeah, like there's the feedback survey. Would love for you guys to fill it out. And I appreciate you guys coming today. It's been a lot of fun. And like I said, I hope we can connect moving down the road.
Yeah, thank you. That was great. Stop the recording.